Across the mountains, the deserts, and the oceans, humans have built cities in places where survival seemed impossible. So for today's video, we're going to take a look at 15 of the most isolated ancient settlements. Starting with number 15, Skara Brae. On the western coast of mainland, the largest of Scotland's Orkney Islands, lies one of Europe's best preserved prehistoric settlements, Skara Brae. It was built around 3100 BCE and occupied for roughly 600 years. This small cluster of stone houses is remarkable, not just for its age, but its location. The Orkneys are far north. They're battered by strong winds, cold seas, and long winters, which makes this settlement both difficult to reach and challenging to sustain. Yet the people who lived there developed a way of life that was surprisingly sophisticated for the time. It consists of 8 interconnected dwellings, each built from stone slabs dug into the earth for insulation, but what stands out is the detail. The stone beds, the shelves, hearths, and storage compartments are still visible. The houses were linked by covered passageways, allowing the residents to move between them while being shielded from the weather outside. Archaeologists believe that the settlement housed around 50 to 100 people at its peak. Isolation played a defining role here. Orkney wasn't part of mainland Britain's main centers of Neolithic life. Instead, it was separated by cold waters that limited any contact. The community likely relied on fishing, farming, hardy crops like barley, and keeping livestock like sheep and cattle. This remoteness here meant that cultural traditions developed somewhat independently, though similarities with other Neolithic monuments in Britain, like the stone circles, suggest some level of exchange still took place. But what makes this place even more striking is the preservation of it. For centuries after being abandoned, the settlement was hidden under sand dunes. It wasn't rediscovered until a storm in 1850 tore away part of the shoreline. Because of its burial under this sand, the site was protected from erosion and looting, making it one of the clearest windows into prehistoric village life. Today, its location is still pretty remote. Visitors have to travel by ferry or a small plane to reach Orkney, showing just how removed this place has always been. Number 14, the Mesa Verde cliff dwellings. In the desert of what is now southwestern Colorado, the ancestral Puebloans built one of the most dramatic settlements in ancient North America, the cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde. From about 600 to 1300 CE, these people created villages that were tucked directly into sandstone alcoves way above the canyons. That setting made the settlements defensible and difficult to reach, offering some safety in the rugged landscape. The most famous of these dwellings, Cliff Palace, contains over 150 rooms and more than 20 kivas, which were ceremonial chambers. Access to these homes often required climbing and using hand and toe holds that were carved into the cliff, making daily life a constant negotiation with the landscape. But isolation was the thing that shaped their culture in profound ways. This whole region is far from any major rivers or fertile valleys, and the high elevation, over 7,000 feet above sea level, made farming pretty challenging. Archaeological evidence suggests that trade networks still connected Mesa Verde to regions as far away as Mexico, but day-to-day survival did depend on careful resource management. By the late 1200s, the settlements were abandoned. Scholars debate the causes, but a combination of prolonged drought, resource depletion, and social pressures likely forced the community to leave. The descendants of these people are today's Pueblo tribes, like the Hopi, the Zuni, and the Rio Grande Pueblo communities. When rediscovered by American settlers in the late 19th century, the cliff dwellings astonished archaeologists for their scale. Unlike open villages that were more exposed to erosion, these stone structures here were protected by the cliffs, leaving behind evidence of daily life, pottery, tools, and even traces of paint on the walls. Mesa Verde is still pretty remote even today. The nearest towns are small, and the national park that protects the dwelling sits in a sparsely populated corner of Colorado. Number 13, Machu Picchu. In the Andes Mountains of Peru is one of the most iconic yet isolated settlements in the world, Machu Picchu. It was built in the mid-15th century during the height of the Inca Empire. This site sits at nearly 8,000 feet above sea level, perched on a ridge between 2 mountain peaks. This location was part of what kept it hidden from the outside world for centuries, and it added to its reputation as one of the most secluded places ever built. Machu Picchu was constructed under the orders of the Inca Emperor Pachacuti around 1450 CE. Archaeologists believe that it may have served as a royal estate, maybe a ceremonial center, or possibly both. What is certain is that its location was chosen with great care. Reaching the site in ancient times meant climbing steep mountain trails through rough terrain, far from any major Inca cities like Cusco. This remoteness provided security, and it may have ensured its exclusivity as a retreat for the elite. The stone and earthwork here is remarkable. Walls of precisely cut granite blocks fit together so tightly not even a blade of grass can slip between them. Such construction like this helped the site withstand earthquakes, which are common in this region. But Machu Picchu remained unknown to the wider world until 1911, when American historian Hiram Bingham brought it to international attention. While the local Quechua people had always known of its existence, the isolation in the cloud forest here kept it hidden from any Spanish conquistadors, which is likely why it was never destroyed during the colonial period. Today, even with modern vehicles, reaching Machu Picchu is not simple. Most visitors travel by train and then take a bus up a winding road or hike along the Inca Trail, which still provides a sense of the site's isolation. But for the Incas, that seclusion was integral. It kept the settlement secure, preserved its sacred atmosphere, and reinforced its role as a place apart from daily life. In many ways, Machu Picchu is defined by its isolation. It's a masterpiece of engineering and a reminder that some of the most extraordinary achievements of the ancient peoples were created in places where few would expect a thriving settlement to even exist. Number 12. Hvalsey. On the southern coast of Greenland lies the ruins of Hvalsey. They're an example of one of the most isolated European settlements of the Middle Ages. Established by Norse settlers around the late 10th century, Hvalsey was part of the Eastern Settlement, one of two main Norse colonies in Greenland. At its height, the settlement was home to hundreds of farms spread across the fjords, but its remoteness made it one of the farthest outposts of medieval Europe. Hvalsey's most famous surviving structure is the stone church, which is the best preserved Norse ruin in Greenland. It was built in the 14th century. This church became an important gathering place for the scattered community. Remarkably, the last written record of the Greenland Norse comes from this church, a wedding held in 1408, mentioned in Icelandic documents. After that, the Norse presence in Greenland fades from history. The settlement was isolated in every sense. The sea crossing from Norway or Iceland to Greenland was long and dangerous, taking weeks under even favorable conditions. Winters in Greenland are harsh, and the settlers had to adapt to shorter growing seasons. Farming was limited to hardy crops and livestock like sheep, goats, and cattle, which was supplemented by hunting seals, walrus, and caribou. Trade with Europe did provide iron, timber, and luxury goods, but contact was irregular. Storms, shifting ice, and political changes in Europe gradually cut off the colony from the outside support. By the 15th century, the Norse of Greenland had vanished, leaving only stone ruins behind. Scholars continued to debate why the settlement was abandoned. Maybe climate change from the onset of Little Ice Age, or soil exhaustion, dwindling trade, maybe even conflict with the Inuit are all considered contributing factors. What is clear, though, is that Hvalsey was one of the most remote outposts of Norse expansion, surviving for centuries in near total isolation before fading away. Today, Hvalsey's ruins are still pretty difficult to reach, requiring a boat trip through icy fjords. But standing among the church walls and scattered farm ruins here, one can sense the enormous distance the Norse settlers placed between themselves and their homeland. Number 11. Petra in Jordan. Deep within the canyons of southern Jordan lies Petra, an ancient capital of the Nabatean kingdom. Carved directly into the sandstone cliffs here, this settlement was established around the 4th century BCE, and it flourished as a major trading hub for centuries. Now, what makes it striking is that despite its beauty, it was effectively concealed from outsiders for much of its history, accessible only through narrow gorges like the Seek. Petra's location was chosen for both defensive and economic reasons. The Nabateans were skilled traders, controlling caravan routes that connected Arabia, Egypt, and the Mediterranean. By situating their city in a hidden valley surrounded by mountains, they could monitor trade while protecting themselves from invasion. At its peak, Petra may have housed 20,000 to 30,000 people, supported by an advanced water management system that included aqueducts, cisterns, and channels to capture scarce rainfall. But despite its importance in antiquity, Petra was largely forgotten about by the outside world after the decline of the Nabateans. Following Roman annexation in 106 CE and a devastating earthquake in 363 CE, the city began to decline. Over the centuries, shifting trade routes and natural disasters left Petra abandoned. By the Middle Ages, it had become a ghost city, known only to local Bedouin tribes. Its rediscovery by the Swiss explorer Johann Ludwig Burckhardt in 1812 brought it back into the world's imagination. But even today, Petra retains its sense of remoteness. To reach it, you gotta travel through dry landscapes and enter through the narrow Takht Canyon, a journey that instantly conveys the isolation the ancient people here relied upon. Petra's story is one of paradox. It's a settlement that was both deeply connected to the wider ancient world through trade, and yet deliberately hidden in one of the most secluded valleys of the Near East. Its isolation was its strength, keeping it secure for centuries, but eventually it also contributed to its decline when trade just shifted elsewhere. Number 10. Chaco Canyon. In the high desert of northwestern New Mexico lies Chaco Canyon, once the center of a huge network of ancestral Puebloan settlements. Between the 9th and 12th centuries CE, the canyon was home to monumental structures known as great houses, which were built from stone and timber in multi-story designs, unlike anything else in North America at the time. This isolation, however, defined its achievements and its challenges. Chaco Canyon is far from fertile farmland or even reliable rivers. The environment here is harsh, cold winters, hot summers, and limited rain. Yet the people who built here developed advanced methods of water control, like dams, canals, and reservoirs to capture seasonal runoff. That enabled them to sustain large populations in a place that, at first glance, seems inhospitable. The great houses, such as the Pueblo Bonito, contain hundreds of rooms and multiple kivas used for ceremonies. Some buildings reached 4 or 5 stories high, and roads radiated out, connecting it to distant communities across the southwest. These roads, remarkably straight and engineered through rough terrain, suggest that Chaco was more than just an isolated village. It was the ceremonial and political heart of a widespread culture. Even so, this remoteness was undeniable. Timber for construction had to be carried from the mountains over 50 miles away, and food production was limited, and trade networks were essential for obtaining goods like turquoise, shells, and even macaws from as far south as Mexico. By the late 12th century, Chaco was abandoned. Extended droughts, resource stress, and social changes probably contributed to its decline. The descendants of the people who lived here are today's Pueblo tribes, who still regard Chaco Canyon as a sacred place. But today, this isolation here is still pretty striking. The canyon lies in a very sparsely populated area far from any major towns, and it requires a long drive over unpaved roads just to reach it. Standing among the ruins of Pueblo Bonito here, it's easy to imagine how remote this place must have felt 1,000 years ago. This is one of the most remarkable examples of ancient settlements in North America, precisely because of this setting. The ability to build monumental architecture and sustain a complex society in such an isolated desert landscape speaks to the ingenuity of its people. Number 9. Great Zimbabwe. Deep in the hills of southeastern Zimbabwe lie the ruined city of Great Zimbabwe, the largest ancient stone settlement in sub-Saharan Africa, south of the Sahara Desert. Built between the 11th and 15th centuries, Great Zimbabwe was the center of a powerful kingdom that controlled regional trade. What makes it pretty striking, though, is that despite its scale and the influence, it was located in a relatively remote inland region far from any coast and major river valley that supported the other African civilizations. The city covers about 1,000 acres, and it's divided into 3 main areas: the hill complex, the Great Enclosure, and the valley ruins. The most famous structure, the Great Enclosure, features a massive stone wall up to 11 meters high and 5 meters thick, built without mortar. These walls encircle a large open space thought to have been used for ceremonies or as a royal residence. The hill complex was perched on a rocky outcrop, and it likely housed elites and religious leaders, while the valley ruins contained the dwellings of the ordinary people. At its peak, it may have supported a population of about 10 to 20,000 people, which was a significant number for this region. Despite the inland location, though, the settlement wasn't isolated from any broader network of trade. Archaeologists have found evidence of goods from as far away as China, Persia, and the Middle East. Yet geographically, it was deeply isolated. Surrounded by hills and savanna, it had no navigable rivers or harbors nearby, and reaching it required long overland journeys. This remoteness may have helped it secure its independence and protect it from external threats, but this also meant that its prosperity depended on carefully maintained trade links through intermediaries on the coast. Today, Great Zimbabwe remains isolated, sitting far from any major modern city. Visitors who travel there encounter a quiet, rural environment where the stone walls rise unexpectedly from the hills. But its isolation is central to its story. It shows how a powerful civilization could emerge in a place far removed from the centers of global trade and empire, relying on control of resources and connections built across long distances. These ruins are a reminder that even in the most remote areas, ancient peoples created thriving and sophisticated settlements. Number 8. Takht-e Soleyman. In the mountains of northwestern Iran is Takht-e Soleyman, or the Throne of Solomon, an isolated settlement with deep religious significance. Built around a natural lake, this site was a major spiritual center for the Zoroastrian religion during the Sasanian Empire that was about 224 to 650 CE. Its location in the mountains here, far from any major cities, added to this remoteness and sanctity. Takht-e Soleyman was centered on a fire temple dedicated to Atar, the divinity of fire, and the sacred lake, which is believed to be bottomless. The settlement here included fortified walls, palaces, and ceremonial halls, making it a place of worship and a political stronghold. The lake at the heart of this place is extraordinary. It's fed by underground springs, and it has a constant temperature and flow, yet its depth and origins are difficult to measure. Ancient people considered it sacred, reinforcing the site's reputation as a place apart from the ordinary world. But isolation defined its role. The high-altitude location meant it was not easily reached, requiring long journeys across very rugged terrain. This remoteness likely preserved the sanctity of the site, keeping it apart from the bustle of cities and trade routes. Pilgrims came specifically to worship, and rulers maintained it as a symbolic center of power. It was eventually abandoned after Mongol times, leaving behind some impressive ruins. And today, the isolation remains. Though accessible by road, it does sit in a sparsely populated part of Iran, and it's recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It still offers insight into how ancient peoples sometimes placed their most important religious centers in remote, difficult-to-reach locations. In both Derinkuyu and Takht-e Soleyman, isolation was central. One settlement hid underground to escape the danger, while the other rose high into the mountains to preserve the sacred. Both of them reveal how ancient peoples used seclusion as a means of survival, spirituality, and identity. Moving on to number 7, Easter Island. One of the most isolated inhabited islands in the world, Easter Island, or Rapa Nui, lies more than 2,000 miles from the coast of South America and about 1,200 miles from the nearest inhabited island, Pitcairn. It was settled around the 12th century by Polynesian voyagers. This tiny volcanic landmass became home to a unique culture that produced the famous Moai statues. Those were monumental stone figures that still stand as its legacy. The isolation here shaped every aspect of its development. The Polynesians who first arrived had no nearby neighbors for trade or contact. They brought with them the knowledge of seafaring, farming, and stone carving. And from this, they built a society that flourished despite being cut off from the wider world. Farming here was essential. Crops like sweet potatoes, taro, and bananas sustained the population, while chickens provided meat. Fishing in the surrounding Pacific waters did also supplement their diet. Those moai, some weighing more than 70 tons, were carved from volcanic rock at a quarry and transported across the island. These statues, erected on stone platforms called ahu, represented ancestors and chiefs, and they embodied the spiritual and social authority. The scale of that undertaking is remarkable, given the island's small size and limited resources here. But the isolation also, however, meant vulnerability. With no outside trade, the community was dependent on its own environment. Over the centuries, deforestation and resource depletion made sustaining the population increasingly difficult. By the 17th century, internal conflict and ecological strain had led to the toppling of many statues and significant cultural upheaval. European contact only came in 1722 when Dutch explorers reached the island. By then, Rapa Nui society had already transformed, but that isolation had preserved many aspects of its culture. Easter Island illustrates how complete separation from the rest of the world can foster both extraordinary cultural achievements and some extreme fragility. The Moai, standing against the backdrop of the endless Pacific, they're symbols of human creativity in one of the planet's most isolated environments. Number 6. Ani, Armenia-Turkey border. On a windy plateau near the modern border between Turkey and Armenia stands the ruins of Ani, once known as the City of 1,001 Churches. Between the 10th and 11th centuries, Ani was once the thriving capital of the Bakotid Armenian Kingdom, home to tens of thousands of people. Today, though, it's an abandoned shell in an isolated landscape. Ani's location contributed to its prosperity and to its isolation. It sat on a trade route between Byzantium, Persia, and the Arab world, but it was also separated from larger centers of power. The city was heavily fortified, with massive stone walls that are still standing, but within those walls were cathedrals, monasteries, palaces, and residential quarters, all built in distinctive Armenian architectural styles. For centuries, Ani was a cultural and economic hub, drawing artisans, merchants, and a clergy, yet the remote position here made it vulnerable. Over the years, it suffered repeated invasions, Seljuks, Mongols, and eventually the Timurids, all of which weakened the city, and a devastating earthquake in 1319 compounded its decline. By the 17th century, Ani was abandoned, left to crumble on its plateau. Today, it's sitting in a sparsely populated border zone, and access is restricted because of the sensitive political situation between Turkey and Armenia. Visitors who reach it are often struck by the emptiness of the surrounding land. The ruined churches and fortifications stand alone against huge grasslands with no modern settlement nearby. Once a thriving metropolis, it now represents how a great city can become forgotten when geography, politics, and natural disaster converge. Its survival as a ruin in one of the most remote corners of the Caucasus highlights how even centers of civilization can become isolated relics of history. Number 5. Cahokia, Illinois. In the bottomlands of Mississippi, near present-day St. Louis, once stood a city so large and complex that early European settlers in the region couldn't believe indigenous peoples had built it. Known today as Cahokia, this pre-Columbian settlement flourished around 1350 CE and was the largest urban center north of Mexico during its time. At its height, it may have rivaled contemporary European cities in size, with a population estimated between 15 to 20,000 people, and possibly more when surrounding areas were included, yet Cahokia was profoundly isolated from the great civilizations of Mesoamerica and the Old World. It grew not in contact with those distant powers, but in the relative seclusion of the American Midwest, developing its own unique political and cultural systems before fading into ruins centuries before European colonization. Cahokia sits at the confluence of the Mississippi, the Missouri, and the Illinois rivers, a location that's made it both strategic and unusual. This wasn't an obvious site for a great city. It lays far from the coasts, removed from long-distance trade routes that linked Mesoamerica with South America and beyond. Instead, though, Cahokia emerged within a regional network of Mississippian cultures, loosely connected groups spread across river valleys from the Great Lakes to the Gulf. These communities shared practices like mound building, maize agriculture, but they had no overarching empire like the Aztecs or Maya. In this context, Cahokia was exceptional, rising suddenly and briefly to dominate the surrounding world. At the heart of Cahokia was Monk's Mound, the largest earthen structure in the Americas. Standing about 100 feet high and covering more than 14 acres, it dwarfed the surrounding land. This monumental mound supported a large building at its summit, most likely the residence of a temple or a chief, and around it spread a carefully planned city with plazas, palisades, neighborhoods, and more than 100 smaller mounds, serving as ceremonial, residential, and burial purposes. The population density here was pretty remarkable for its time and place. Most Native American communities in the region were small villages or hamlets, yet Cahokia concentrated thousands in one area. Excavations have revealed tightly packed houses, organized neighborhoods, and evidence of craft specialization like shell bead production and pottery workshops. Despite the impressive growth, though, Cahokia was isolated in important ways. It had no system of writing, unlike the Maya, and no metal tools or beasts of burden. Its builders worked entirely with stone, wood, bone, and earth. Yet the agricultural record shows long-distance trade did reach Cahokia indirectly. Marine shells from the Gulf Coast, copper from the Great Lakes, mica from the Appalachians, and obsidian from the Rocky Mountains all found their way to the city. These kinds of goods demonstrated Cahokia's role as a hub in a continent-wide network, but also underline its isolation from direct access to the world's most advanced technologies of the time. Yet life in Cahokia was not without violence. Archaeological evidence, including mass graves at Mound 72, reveals practices of human sacrifice, likely tied to elite burials and religious ceremonies. These discoveries show a society capable of both remarkable achievements in organization and monuments of brutality tied to maintaining power and spiritual order. After centuries of growth, the city entered a period of instability in the 13th century. Environmental pressures also played a role. Pollen records indicate episodes of flooding and drought, which would have disrupted their agriculture. Overpopulation too strained resources, while deforestation and soil exhaustion reduced the crop yield. There is also evidence of social unrest. A defensive palisade was built around the central precinct, suggesting conflict or fear of attack. By around 1350, Cahokia was largely abandoned. This disappearance of Cahokia puzzled archaeologists for centuries. Without written records, understanding its rise and fall depends entirely on physical evidence. But what is clear is that Cahokia was unique. It wasn't simply one node in a larger empire, but a singular city-state that emerged in isolation and collapsed without leaving a successor. Today, Cahokia Mound State Historic Site preserves what remains of the city. Visitors can climb Monk's Mound and look out across a landscape that's still dotted with those mounds, though the modern city of Collinsville encroaches nearby. But even so, standing on the mound's summit gives a sense of the scale and ambition of Cahokia's builders. The site was designated UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1982, which recognized its global importance. Number 4. Chan Chan, Peru. On the northern coast of Peru, in one of the driest desert regions on the planet, lies the large adobe city of Chan Chan. Built by the Chimu civilization around the 9th century CE, Chan Chan was the largest pre-Columbian city in South America and the largest adobe city in the world. At its peak, it covered more than 20 square kilometers and had a population of about 30 to 40,000 people. The city was built in the Moche Valley in a hyper-arid coastal strip where survival depended entirely on irrigation. Without rivers or rainfall, the desert is inhospitable, yet the Chimu harnessed waters from rivers flowing down from the Andes. This reliance on artificial irrigation highlights the settlement's isolation. The Chimu had to engineer their environment to survive, cut off from the natural fertility that sustained other civilizations. The architecture of Chan Chan is pretty cool. The city was organized into 9 large citadels or palatial compounds, each built for a different Chimu ruler. These complexes include ceremonial plazas, storerooms, burial platforms, and residences that were all constructed from adobe bricks. Within the citadels, mazes of passageways and enclosed courtyards reinforced the sense of a society that was structured around hierarchy and control. But unlike other Andean civilizations that emphasized monumental stone construction, the Chimu built with adobe, a practical choice in the desert where rain was virtually non-existent. This material allowed them to construct on a massive scale, but it also left the city vulnerable to erosion once it was abandoned. Still though, the sheer expanse of Chan Chan makes it one of the most impressive urban centers of the pre-Columbian world. Isolation here also shaped the political and cultural identity of the Chimu. Chan Chan was the center of a regional state that eventually grew into an empire that controlled nearly 1,000 kilometers of Peru's coastline. Yet despite this territorial reach, the Chimu remained distinct from their highland neighbors. Like the Inca, their reliance on irrigation agriculture, their adobe architecture, and their maritime traditions set them apart. Even when the Inca eventually conquered Chan Chan in the late 15th century, they adopted elements of Chimu craftsmanship, particularly their mastery of metallurgy and textiles. Their society was rigidly hierarchical, with a divine ruler at the top, supported by elites who managed resources and labor. Evidence suggests that commoners had little mobility, with labor obligations tied to their status. The citadels themselves symbolize that hierarchy, with rulers living in massive fortified compounds, and ordinary people occupied simpler dwellings outside the monumental core. Despite its achievements, though, Chan Chan was not immune to the vulnerabilities of isolation. The very canals that sustained it were subject to disruption, particularly during El Niño events that brought sudden floods and shifts in rivers. Unlike highland civilizations that could rely on more varied environments, the Chimu were tied directly to their fragile desert coastal niche. The city's ultimate decline came from not the environment, however, but from conquest. In the late 15th century, the Inca expanded northward from Cusco, absorbing the Chimu Empire. Chan Chan was captured around 1470 CE and its ruler was taken hostage. The Inca dismantled parts of the irrigation system to weaken the city's independence, and over time, Chan Chan's role as a political and cultural center diminished. European chroniclers marveled at the size of the ruins here, describing them as a city of giants because of their scale. Yet for centuries, the true significance of Chan Chan remained underappreciated, overshadowed by the more famous Inca capital and their monumental sites in the Andes. Modern archaeology, however, has revealed its importance as a unique urban experiment in one of the harshest environments. Number 3. Nan Madol, Micronesia. On the island of Pohnpei in the Federated States of Micronesia is one of the most extraordinary ancient isolated settlements in the world, Nan Madol. It's sometimes called the Venice of the Pacific. Nan Madol is a city built not on land, but on a lagoon constructed atop a network of artificial islets that are linked by canals. Created between the 12th and 16th centuries by the Sorulur dynasty, it functioned as a political and ceremonial capital. Now, what makes it unique is this setting here, an immense stone city in the middle of the Pacific, thousands of miles from any major civilization, built with engineering techniques that remain remarkable even today. The site covers roughly 200 acres and consists of more than 90 islets that were built up from coral and basalt. The islets were separated by narrow canals, which allowed canoes to move between them, and the effect was a city that floated upon the sea, simultaneously isolated yet interconnected. The basalt used to build Nan Madol is one of its most striking features. The columns, sometimes weighing several tons, were quarried from volcanic flows on the opposite side of the island. Transporting these stones over huge terrain and open water would have been an immense challenge. But archaeologists believe the stones were rafted along the coast and maneuvered into place with coordinated manpower. But the precision at which they were stacked, without mortar yet still standing centuries later, shows a sophisticated understanding of engineering. Nan Madol was not simply a settlement, but a carefully organized city. Different islets served different functions. Some were reserved for chiefly residences, others for religious ceremonies, and still others for burial vaults. The most prominent islet, Nandawas, contains massive stone walls up to 25 feet high, enclosing a central tomb believed to hold the remains of the Sorulur rulers. Other islets feature platforms for dwellings, canoe landings, and areas for food preparation. This layout suggests a high degree of planning, with space divided according to social and political hierarchy. While legends emphasize the supernatural, the reality is that Nan Madol represented the centralization of power in an otherwise dispersed island society. The Sorulur imposed a system of tribute on the surrounding population, requiring clans across Pohnpei to supply food, labor, and resources to support the rulers. In this sense, Nan Madol was as much a symbol of control as it was a functioning city. Its very isolation reinforced the authorities of the rulers. Despite its power, though, Nan Madol was never a large city in terms of permanent residents. Archaeologists estimate that only 1,000 people lived there at its peak, primarily the nobility, the priests, and attendants of the Sorulur court. The majority of the population lived in villages scattered across the island's interior and coasts. By the 16th century, the Sorulur dynasty collapsed. Oral histories attribute the fall to oppressive rule and the arrival of a challenger who led a rebellion that overthrew the dynasty. Afterward, Nan Madol declined as the political center of Pohnpei, though it remained a place of ritual significance. Archaeological research continues to reveal details of this site. Excavations here have uncovered tools made of basalt and coral, pottery fragments, and remains of food like fish bones and shells. Radiocarbon dating confirms construction began around the 12th century, with major building phases continued for several hundred years. Today, though, Nan Madol is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and it's recognized for its culture and for its fragility. The ruins are threatened by encroaching mangroves, rising sea levels, and erosion. Yet for those who reach it, Nan Madol is unforgettable. Approaching by boat, the sight of towering stone walls rising up from the lagoon gives the impression of a lost city emerging from the sea. Number 2. Timbuktu, Mali. Few names in world history carry the same aura of remoteness and mystery as Timbuktu. It's located on the southern edge of the Sahara Desert in present-day Mali. Timbuktu became a center of learning, trade, and culture during the medieval period. For centuries, its very name evoked distance and inaccessibility, a place so far removed from the known world that it came to symbolize the ends of the earth. Yet Timbuktu was not just an isolated outpost. At its height, it was a thriving city of scholars, merchants, and rulers, a beacon of culture in one of the harshest environments on the planet. Timbuktu emerged around the 12th century as a seasonal encampment of the Tuareg, a nomadic people who traveled across the Sahara with their camels. The settlement grew at a strategic point where trans-Saharan caravan routes met the Niger River. This unusual geography gave Timbuktu both its opportunity and its isolation. Caravans carrying salt, gold, ivory, and slaves crossed huge stretches of desert to reach the city, while the Niger provided access to the agricultural lands of the Sahel and the forests further south. By the 14th century, Timbuktu was incorporated into the Mali Empire under the famous ruler Mansa Musa. Musa's pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, during which he distributed enormous amounts of gold, placed Mali, and by extension Timbuktu, onto the world map. At its peak, Timbuktu's population may have reached 100,000 people, a remarkable number for such an isolated desert location. The city became known above all for its scholarship. 3 major mosques here served not only as places of worship, but as universities. Thousands of students gathered to study theology, law, mathematics, astronomy, and medicine, and manuscripts copied and preserved in Timbuktu's libraries numbered in the hundreds of thousands, many of which survive today in private collections. Isolation, though, also made Timbuktu vulnerable. In 1591, the Moroccan army invaded, defeating the Songhai Empire and capturing Timbuktu. While the city remained inhabited, its political influence declined, trade routes shifted, and the rise of Atlantic commerce diverted wealth to the coastal ports. By the 17th and 18th centuries, Timbuktu was a shadow of its former self, still remote and still populated, but no longer the hub it had been. Not until the 19th century did European explorers make it to Timbuktu and return with descriptions. By then, the city's golden age had long since passed, but its reputation for its isolation and mystery endured. The great mosques were built from mud brick reinforced with wooden beams that still project from their walls. This style is distinctive to the Sahel and it emphasizes the adaptation to the desert environment. Unlike some stone monuments in other parts of the world, Timbuktu's mud brick structures require constant maintenance. This is a reminder of the fragile balance between human settlement and natural forces in an isolated desert city. Number 1. Axum, Ethiopia. In the northern highlands of Ethiopia is Axum, the ancient capital of the Axumite Empire, which flourished between the 1st and the 7th centuries. Though Axum was once a powerful kingdom that controlled trade along the Red Sea, the setting in the Ethiopian highlands made it one of the most geographically isolated civilizations of antiquity. Axum was remarkable for its achievements. It developed monumental architecture, including enormous stone stelae carved from single blocks of granite, some standing over 30 meters tall. These stelae served as grave markers for rulers, and they remained among the largest monolithic monuments ever built. The city also had palaces, underground tombs, and churches, including the Church of St. Mary of Zion, which Ethiopian tradition associates with the Ark of the Covenant. Despite its isolation, though, Axum played a significant role in long-distance trade. The position near the Red Sea allowed it to control routes between the Roman Empire, India, and sub-Saharan Africa. Axumite coins that were minted in gold, silver, and bronze have been found as far away as India, showing its economic reach. But yet, unlike Rome or Persia, Axum developed largely on its own terms. The mountains shielded it from many outside influences, allowing a distinctive culture to emerge. Religion was central to their identity. In the 4th century CE, King Ezana converted to Christianity, making Axum one of the earliest Christian kingdoms in the world. This isolation of faith gave the region a unique trajectory. While surrounded by non-Christian states, Axum remained steadfastly Christian, a tradition that endures in Ethiopia to this day. Axum's decline, though, came gradually. By the 7th century, the rise of Islamic powers in Arabia shifted trade away from the Red Sea, cutting Axum off from its primary markets. Environmental changes like deforestation and soil exhaustion may have also weakened the kingdom. Over time, political power shifted southward, and Axum became less important, though it did retain its sacred status in Ethiopian Christianity. Today, Axum is a small town, but its ruins still testify to its ancient greatness. The towering stele field, the remains of royal tombs, and the churches all stand in a remote land far removed from global centers. Visitors have to travel deep into Ethiopia's highlands to reach it, and the sense of isolation here remains palpable. Though cut off geographically, Axum is still engaged in far-reaching trade and diplomacy. Axum's story illustrates how isolation can coexist with influence. Yet when global patterns shifted, its remoteness left it vulnerable. The ruins that remain underscore how one of the world's earliest Christian civilizations thrived in a place apart from the main currents of history.